The courtroom fell into complete silence. All eyes were on Judge Linda Hayes, a woman whose reputation for arrogance and cruelty had earned her fear and resentment from everyone who stepped into her courtroom. She sat high on her bench, looking down at the man standing before her, Officer Jamal Carter. She smirked. "I never thought I'd see the day a boy like you would wear a badge," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "You people are more suited for handcuffs than a uniform." Gasps filled the room. The court stenographer stopped typing. Even the bailiff, a longtime associate of Judge Hayes, widened his eyes in disbelief. But the person who remained the calmest in the room was Officer Carter himself. He didn't flinch. He didn't react. He simply stared at her with the patience of a man who knew something she didn't. Then, just 7 minutes later, she was the one in handcuffs. The same courtroom that had just witnessed her cruelty now erupted into chaos. Judge Hayes' face went pale as Officer Carter stepped forward, badge in hand. "Judge Hayes, you are under arrest." His voice was steady, unwavering. "What? On what charges?" she screamed, trying to maintain the power she had just moments ago. Carter didn't blink. Corruption, tampering with evidence, accepting bribes, and abuse of power. Judge Hayes' mouth opened, but no words came out. The irony of the moment crushed her like a mountain collapsing on her chest. She looked around, expecting someone to intervene, to defend her. But no one did. The very people who had cowered before her now watched with silent satisfaction. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut sent a chill through the room. Judge Hayes, the woman who had sentenced countless people with a smug smile, was now being led away like a common criminal. And the man arresting her? The same black officer she had just insulted. But how did it come to this? How did one of the most feared judges in the city go from ruling the courtroom to being a prisoner in it? The answer lay in what had happened before this moment. Officer Jamal Carter had always believed in justice. He had grown up in a rough neighborhood, watching his friends get swallowed by the system. Some deserved it, but others? Others had simply been victims of a game rigged against them. That's why he became a cop, not to be part of the problem, but to be part of the solution. But the system was cruel. It didn't welcome people like him. It spat them out, chewed them up, and expected them to give up. He didn't. He worked harder, smarter, and soon, he became one of the best detectives in the department. Which is why, when a major corruption case involving Judge Hayes landed on his desk, he knew this was his moment. He had seen what she did. She took money under the table. She falsified records. She destroyed lives with a flick of her pen. And when she had nothing else to do, she insulted people like him, believing she was untouchable. But Jamal knew something she didn't. He had the evidence. For weeks, he and his team had been gathering proof. Hidden bank transactions, recorded conversations, witness testimonies. Piece by piece, he had built an ironclad case. But he had kept it quiet. If Judge Hayes got a whiff of what was coming, she would destroy it all. So he planned carefully. The day of the court hearing, he arrived early, sitting in the audience as a silent observer. His case against her was already filed. The arrest warrant was ready. He just needed her to be exactly who she was: proud, arrogant, and cruel. And she played her part perfectly. When she saw him in her courtroom, she couldn't resist. She spewed her hatred, her racism, her superiority. She thought she was untouchable. But as she laughed at him, as she humiliated him in front of the entire courtroom, she had no idea that she was minutes away from losing everything. After her words, a thick silence settled over the room. No one spoke. It was as if the air itself had become heavy, crushing the atmosphere. Then, Carter stood up. "Judge Hayes," he said, his voice firm, steady. "I've been watching you for a long time." She scoffed. "Oh, have you now?" "Yes," he replied. "And now it's time for justice." She frowned. "What are you talking about?" Carter pulled out a piece of paper. "This is a warrant for your arrest." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, and shocked murmurs filled the air. Judge Hayes' face turned red. You can't be serious." "I am," Carter said. "And trust me, Judge Hayes, this is long overdue." As the bailiff, who had served under her for years, hesitated to move, another officer stepped forward. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed her arm. "Get your hands off me," she screamed. But there was no one left to listen to her. The walls of power she had built around herself had crumbled. She looked around in desperation, but the people who had once feared her now looked at her with something else. Satisfaction. As the handcuffs clicked shut, her world collapsed. And this was just the beginning. Judge Linda Hayes' face twisted with rage and disbelief. She struggled against the officers, but it was no use. The cold steel of the handcuffs tightened around her wrists, a feeling she had never imagined she would experience. "You think you can do this to me?" she snarled, her voice shaking with fury. "I am the law in this city. This is my courtroom." Jamal Carter didn't flinch. He simply looked her dead in the eyes and said, "Not anymore." The entire courtroom was still in shock. Reporters who had come to cover other cases were now scrambling to grab their cameras, their hands shaking as they tried to capture the moment. The whispers among the spectators grew louder. "This is crazy," someone muttered. "Did he really just arrest a judge?" another whispered. Judge Hayes turned her head wildly, searching for an ally. Her eyes landed on the bailiff. "Do something," she screamed. "Stop them." The bailiff, an older man who had worked under her for years, took a step forward. For a second, it looked like he might intervene. But then, as if realizing something, he stopped. His shoulders slumped, and he took a step back. He wasn't going to save her. Judge Hayes' breathing became erratic. "This is a mistake. This is a mistake," she shrieked. "You don't know who you're messing with, boy." Jamal clenched his jaw at the word, but he remained calm. "I know exactly who I'm messing with. And I know exactly where you're going." He nodded to his fellow officers. "Take her." As they led her toward the exit, Judge Hayes thrashed. "This is illegal. This is illegal. I demand to speak to the governor." Jamal allowed himself a small smirk. "Oh, don't worry, Judge. The governor already knows." The moment those words left his mouth, she froze. Her eyes widened, and for the first time, real fear crept onto her face. The doors swung open, and she was dragged out of the courtroom, her screams echoing through the halls. And just like that, the mighty Judge Linda Hayes was gone. The courtroom was left in stunned silence. Jamal stood in the center of it all, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle onto his shoulders. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but now that it was real, it felt surreal. One of the reporters broke the silence. "Detective Carter," she called out, holding a microphone. "Can you tell us what just happened?" Jamal sighed, rubbing his temple. "Not much I can say right now. Just know that justice is finally being served." The reporters weren't satisfied with that. They swarmed toward him, throwing out question after question. "How long have you been investigating Judge Hayes? What specific charges is she facing? Did she really take bribes?" Jamal ignored them. He had no time for media games. There was still more work to do. He turned and made his way toward the back exit of the courtroom, his mind racing. Outside, Judge Hayes was shoved into the back of a police cruiser. She was breathing heavily, her face red with fury. "You have no idea what you've done," she hissed at the officer sitting next to her. The officer didn't respond. She glared at him. "You're all going to regret this." Still, no answer. Her breathing grew ragged. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to calm down. She had to think. She had to be smart. She wasn't going to prison. No, she was going to fight back. And when she did, she would make them all pay. Meanwhile, Jamal was back at his precinct, standing in front of his captain's desk. Captain Morris, a hard-faced man with graying hair, leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "I have to say, Carter, you've got some serious balls." Jamal nodded. "I know." The captain smirked. "You really just arrested a sitting judge in her own courtroom. Do you know how many people would be too scared to even try that?" "She was corrupt," Jamal said firmly. "She needed to go down." "Oh, I agree," Morris said. "But this isn't going to be easy. You've made a lot of enemies today. I've been making enemies my whole life." The captain chuckled. "That's what I like about you. But listen," he leaned forward. "This isn't over." Jamal frowned. "What do you mean?" Morris exhaled heavily. Judge Hayes had powerful friends. People who won't let this slide. People who will do whatever it takes to protect their own. Jamal crossed his arms. "Let them try." The captain gave him a long look. Then, slowly, he nodded. "All right, Carter. Just watch your back." Jamal turned to leave. As he walked out of the office, he could feel it. The storm that was coming. Judge Hayes wasn't the type to go down quietly. And he knew this fight was just beginning. Hours later, in the dead of night, inside a cold prison cell, Judge Hayes sat on the edge of a hard cot, her hands clenched into fists. The cell door creaked open. A man in a dark suit stepped inside. He was tall, with cold, calculating eyes. Hayes looked up at him. "You're here," she whispered. "Thank God." The man didn't smile. "You messed up, Linda." Her face twisted. It's not my fault. That boy set me up. The man sighed. That boy is smarter than you gave him credit for. She leaned forward, her eyes filled with desperation. You have to fix this. You have to get me out of here. The man stared at her for a long moment. Then he spoke. I can help you. Hayes exhaled in relief. But, he continued, his voice low and sharp, there's a price. Hayes' breath caught in her throat. The man stepped closer, his shadow stretching over her. You want revenge, don't you? A slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. Oh, yes, she whispered. I want revenge. The man nodded. Then let's make it happen. And just like that, the war had begun. Judge Linda Hayes leaned forward, her eyes locked onto the mysterious man standing before her. He had no name, no introduction, just a cold, calculating presence that sent a chill through the air. You want revenge, he repeated. His voice was steady, emotionless. Hayes exhaled, her breath shaky but determined. Yes, I want that boy ruined. I want his career, his life, everything he holds dear, gone. The man smirked, a slight curl of his lips that barely reached his eyes. Careful what you wish for, Judge. Revenge isn't cheap. Hayes scoffed. Money is not an issue. I still have people. Powerful people. I can make this go away. The man gave her a long, slow look, then shook his head. You still don't get it, do you? He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You're not on the bench anymore. You're not untouchable. Right now, you're just another criminal in an orange jumpsuit. Nobody's afraid of you anymore. Hayes clenched her fists. That's where you're wrong. I still have influence. I know things, secrets about the people in power. If I go down, they go down with me. The man chuckled. That's more like it. Now you're thinking like a survivor. She took a deep breath, regaining some of her composure. What do you want from me? The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded note. He handed it to her. This is the number of a lawyer. Call him. He'll handle the legal mess. Hayes unfolded the note, eyes narrowing at the name. Marcus Vance. Never heard of him. You wouldn't have, the man replied. He's not the kind of lawyer you find in fancy offices. He's the kind you call when you need things to disappear. She smirked. Perfect. The man turned to leave, but paused at the doorway. Without looking back, he added, Oh, and Judge, if you want Carter destroyed, you better be ready to do whatever it takes. A slow, sinister smile spread across her face. You have no idea what I'm willing to do. The cell door slammed shut behind him. Jamal Carter sat in his apartment, exhaustion weighing heavy on his shoulders. The city outside his window was alive with its usual sounds, cars honking, distant sirens wailing, people shouting on the streets. But inside his home, everything was quiet. Too quiet. He leaned back on his couch, rubbing his temples. Today had been insane. He had arrested a judge in her own courtroom. He should have been celebrating. But something in his gut told him this wasn't over. His phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up and saw a text from Captain Morris. Need you in the office first thing tomorrow. Got intel. Be ready. Jamal frowned. Intel? About what? He sighed and set the phone down. His gut feeling was right. This was far from over. The next morning, Jamal walked into the precinct, coffee in hand, his mind still replaying the events from the courtroom. As soon as he stepped inside, he could tell something was off. Officers were whispering, throwing glances in his direction. Some looked impressed. Others looked worried. He reached Captain Morris' office and knocked once before stepping in. Morris was already waiting, his expression grim. Close the door, he said. Jamal did as he was told. What's going on? Morris sighed, tossing a file onto the desk. Hayes isn't backing down. She's already making moves. Jamal picked up the file and flipped it open. His eyes scanned the contents, and his stomach dropped. It was his file. His personal file. And it was thick. What the hell is this? He muttered. Dirt, Morris said. They're trying to take you down, Carter. They're pulling everything. Every case you've ever worked. Every decision you've ever made. They're looking for something, anything, they can use against you. Jamal clenched his jaw. She's trying to discredit me. Exactly, Morris said. And if she can't find anything real, she'll make something up. Jamal exhaled sharply. So what do we do? Morris leaned back. We play it smart. I need you to keep your head down. Don't give them an excuse to come after you. Jamal shook his head. Captain, that's not who I am. I don't hide. Morris gave him a hard look. And that's what I like about you. But listen to me, this woman. She's dangerous. She's been in the system too long. She knows how to twist the law to her advantage. You need to be careful. Jamal clenched his fists. He wasn't afraid of Judge Hayes. He expected her to fight back. But going after his career, his reputation, that was a dirty game. And if she wanted war, she was going to get one. Meanwhile, in a sleek, private office downtown, Judge Hayes sat across from Marcus Vance, the lawyer she had been told to contact. Vance was young, sharp, and dressed in an expensive gray suit. He leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against his desk. "You want revenge," he said, his voice smooth. "Yes," Hayes said firmly. Vance smirked. "Then let's talk strategy." He flipped open a folder. Inside were documents, reports, and most importantly, Jamal Carter's history. "This man isn't perfect," Vance continued. "He's got a clean record, but everyone has something." He pushed the file toward her. "We're going to destroy him." Hayes' eyes flickered with excitement. Vance leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And when we're done, Detective Carter won't just lose his job. He'll lose everything." Hayes smirked. "Good. Let's begin." That night, Jamal sat at his desk, reviewing case files, when his phone buzzed again. A private number. He hesitated, then answered. "Carter." Silence. Then, a slow, deliberate voice spoke. "You made a mistake." Jamal's grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this?" More silence. Then, the voice chuckled softly. "You took down the wrong person, detective. Now we're coming for you." The line went dead. Jamal's jaw clenched. His heart pounded. This wasn't just a fight anymore. This was war. Jamal Carter stared at his phone, his mind racing. The voice on the other end had been calm, deliberate, too confident. Whoever it was, they weren't just threatening him. They were warning him. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He had dealt with criminals, gang leaders, and corrupt politicians before. But this was different. This was personal. He played the call back in his head. "You took down the wrong person, detective. Now we're coming for you." He had expected retaliation from Judge Hayes. But this wasn't just some old judge throwing a tantrum. This was organized. Someone was backing her. And that meant things were about to get ugly. Across town, in the penthouse suite of a luxury hotel, Judge Hayes sipped a glass of wine as she watched the city lights flicker outside. She was no longer in a jail cell. The moment Marcus Vance had taken her case, things had moved fast. A judge she had history with had signed off on her release, and just like that, she was back on the outside. Free. But she wasn't celebrating. Not yet. Sitting across from her was the man who had visited her in jail, the one who had offered her a way out. "I assume your little phone call was delivered?" Hayes asked, swirling the wine in her glass. The man, dressed in all black, smirked. "Oh, he got the message." Hayes chuckled. "Good. Let's see how long he lasts under pressure." Marcus Vance, who had been quietly going through files, spoke without looking up. "Carter is dangerous if left unchecked. We need to hit him hard before he has time to counter." Hayes leaned forward. "What's the plan?" Vance smirked, sliding a thick folder across the table. "We ruin him. Publicly. Legally. Completely." Hayes opened the folder, her eyes scanning the pages. Her smirk grew wider. "Oh, Detective Carter," she whispered. "You have no idea what's coming." The next morning, Jamal arrived at the precinct earlier than usual. He had barely slept. Captain Morris was waiting for him. "We need to talk," Morris said, leading him into his office. He shut the door, his expression unreadable. Jamal took a seat. "What's going on?" Morris sighed, tossing a newspaper onto the desk. Jamal's stomach dropped. The front page headline read, "Corrupt Cop? The Shocking Truth About Detective Jamal Carter." Underneath was a blurry photo of him, followed by a list of allegations. Bribery, misconduct, evidence tampering. All of it lies. Jamal snatched up the paper, scanning the article. "They're saying I framed innocent people," he muttered. "That I covered up crimes for criminals?" He threw the paper down, anger rising in his chest. "This is insane." Morris folded his arms. "They're coming after you, Carter. They want to destroy your reputation before you can fight back." Jamal clenched his jaw. "This is Hayes." "Of course it's Hayes," Morris said. "And she's got help. Serious help." Jamal ran a hand over his face. "How many people are going to believe this?" Morris hesitated. "Enough." Jamal's phone buzzed. Another private number. He answered. Silence. Then, that same voice from last night. "You like the newspaper, detective?" Jamal's grip tightened. "Who are you?" The man chuckled. Let's just say I'm the one cleaning up your mess. Jamal's eyes darkened. You're working for Hayes. I work for people who matter. And right now, you're not one of them. Jamal's pulse pounded. You're making a mistake. Oh, you made the mistake, the voice said. Arresting a judge in her courtroom? That was reckless. Now, we're going to take everything from you. Click. The line went dead. Jamal slowly lowered the phone. Morris studied his face. You okay? Jamal exhaled sharply. They're not stopping. Morris nodded. Then we hit back. Jamal's eyes burned with determination. He wasn't going to just survive this. He was going to win. Meanwhile, Hayes was sitting comfortably in her luxury hotel, sipping another glass of wine, when Marcus Vance walked in. It's done, he said. The media's eating it up. The public's already turning against him. Hayes grinned. Good. What's next? Vance smirked. We take it up a notch. He placed another file on the table. This is going to be the nail in Carter's coffin. Hayes' eyes gleamed as she opened the folder. And when she saw what was inside, she laughed. This, she whispered, is perfect. That evening, Jamal was sitting at his desk when an officer rushed in. Carter, the officer said breathlessly. You need to see this. Jamal turned to the screen in the precinct's media room. A breaking news segment was playing. A serious-looking reporter stared into the camera. Shocking new evidence has emerged in the case of Detective Jamal Carter. Sources claim that Carter has been secretly involved with known criminals, accepting bribes, and even helping to cover up violent crimes in the city. An official internal investigation has now been launched against him. Jamal's blood ran cold. Internal investigation? They were trying to take his badge. He turned to Morris. They're setting me up. Morris nodded grimly. And they're doing a damn good job of it. Jamal's phone buzzed again. Another private number. He let it ring. He already knew who it was. And he knew exactly what they wanted him to feel. Fear. Panic. But they had underestimated him. Jamal Carter wasn't going down that easily. If they wanted a war, they had just gotten one. Jamal Carter stood in the middle of the precinct, his hands clenched into fists. The newsroom screen flickered in front of him, broadcasting lies, smearing his name with accusations that had no truth. He forced himself to breathe, to think. He couldn't afford to lose control, not now. That was exactly what they wanted. Captain Morris placed a hand on his shoulder. Carter, listen to me. This isn't just bad. It's career-ending if we don't move fast. Jamal looked him in the eye. How long do we have before Internal Affairs gets here? Morris checked his watch. An hour, maybe less. And trust me, they're coming in hot. If they find anything that even looks suspicious, you're done. Jamal nodded. He had expected this. Judge Hayes wasn't just trying to ruin his name. She was making sure he never wore a badge again. But she had underestimated him. Fine, Jamal said. Then let's fight back. Morris smirked. That's what I wanted to hear. Meanwhile, in the depths of a five-star hotel, Judge Hayes sat in a leather chair, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the table. Marcus Vance stood beside her, scrolling through his phone. It's happening, Vance said with a satisfied smirk. Internal Affairs will take him down. The department won't risk keeping someone corrupt on payroll, not after this much bad press. Hayes smiled, sipping her wine. Good. That boy embarrassed me. Now, he'll know what it feels like to have everything taken away. Vance nodded. And if that doesn't work, we have other ways to get rid of him. Hayes raised an eyebrow. Do tell. Vance slid a thin folder across the table. She opened it and grinned. Oh, she whispered. This is going to be fun. Jamal paced the precinct, his mind working a mile a minute. He had 1 hour before Internal Affairs arrived, and he needed to act now. Morris grabbed his arm. Look, Carter, you need to tell me everything you know about this case. What dirt do we have on Hayes that she doesn't want getting out? Jamal exhaled. We have bank records. Witnesses. She took bribes, tampered with evidence. Hell, she even had cases dismissed for criminals who paid the right price. Morris nodded. So, where's the evidence now? Jamal frowned. Locked up. Chain of custody. But if she has enough power, she could find a way to make it disappear. Morris cursed under his breath. Then we need a backup plan. Jamal thought for a second. We leak it. Morris blinked. What? Jamal grabbed his phone. If Hayes is using the media to destroy me, then we flip the script. We expose her before she has a chance to erase everything. Morris scratched his head. That's risky, Carter. If we mess this up, it could backfire. Jamal stared at him. We don't have a choice. Morris sighed. All right. Who do we trust to run this? Jamal already had a name in mind. 15 minutes later, Jamal pulled into a parking lot just outside an old diner. Inside, at a booth in the back, sat Maya Delgado, one of the city's most ruthless investigative journalists. She smirked as he slid into the seat across from her. Well, if it isn't the man of the hour, she teased. Jamal exhaled. Maya, I don't have time for jokes. I need your help. She leaned forward, intrigued. Go on. Jamal placed a flash drive on the table. This has everything on Hayes. Bank transactions, evidence tampering, witness statements, everything. Maya whistled. Damn, this is huge. Jamal nodded. I need you to break the story before Internal Affairs drags me out of my office. Maya studied him carefully. You're sure about this? If I publish this, there's no undoing it. This will burn bridges permanently. Jamal's eyes darkened. Do it. Maya nodded and grabbed the flash drive. This is going to be fun, she muttered. Back at the precinct, Jamal had barely sat down when Internal Affairs stormed in. The lead investigator, a tall, no-nonsense man named Agent Reynolds, stepped forward. Detective Carter, Reynolds said coolly, you are under investigation for corruption, bribery, and misconduct. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending further review. Jamal didn't move, didn't flinch. He just smiled. Reynolds frowned. Something funny, detective? Jamal leaned back in his chair. No, I just hope you checked the news today. Reynolds glanced at one of the officers, who quickly pulled out his phone. His eyes widened. Sir, the officer said, showing Reynolds the screen. Jamal folded his arms. Looks like I'm not the only one under investigation anymore. Reynolds' face paled as he read the headline. Breaking, Judge Linda Hayes caught in corruption scandal, bribery, case tampering, and criminal ties exposed. The entire precinct went silent. Jamal smirked. You were saying, Agent? Reynolds clenched his jaw. This doesn't change anything. We still have to investigate you. Jamal stood. Go ahead. But I'd be more worried about your real criminal right now. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Officers started murmuring. Some of them, who had doubted him just minutes ago, were now looking at him with a different expression. Respect. Reynolds knew he had lost control of the situation. He shot a glare at Jamal. This isn't over. Jamal smirked. No, but it's a hell of a start. Meanwhile, in the penthouse suite, Judge Hayes was screaming at her television. How? She bellowed, throwing her wine glass at the screen. Marcus Vance looked just as furious, his phone blowing up with calls from lawyers, politicians, and old associates who were now trying to distance themselves from her. This wasn't supposed to happen, Vance muttered. That cop, he flipped the script. Hayes' breathing was ragged. Fine. You want to play dirty, Carter? She turned to Vance. Find me someone who doesn't play by the rules. Vance hesitated. You sure about that? Hayes' eyes burned with hatred. Get it done. Jamal sat at his desk, rubbing his temples. He had won the first battle. But the war? It was far from over. His phone buzzed. A message. From an unknown number. He opened it. One sentence. Enjoy your little victory, Carter. You won't live to see the next one. Jamal's heart pounded. This wasn't just a fight anymore. This was survival. Jamal Carter read the text again, his mind racing. Enjoy your little victory, Carter. You won't live to see the next one. This wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. His fingers hovered over his phone, debating whether to call Morris, but he knew the captain would tell him what he already knew. This was getting worse. Judge Hayes wasn't just trying to ruin him anymore. She was trying to end him. Jamal exhaled, forcing himself to think clearly. Panic wasn't an option. If Hayes was desperate enough to send a death threat, that meant she was losing control. And desperate people made mistakes. And mistakes? That's how criminals got caught. He pocketed his phone and stood up. If they were coming for him, he wasn't going to sit around waiting. He was going to bring the fight to them. Across town, Judge Linda Hayes sat in the back seat of a sleek black SUV, her fingers tapping against her knee. Next to her, Marcus Vance scrolled through his phone, his jaw tight. We need to be smart, he said. Right now, Carter is on high alert. We push too hard, too fast, and this whole thing backfires. Hayes turned her sharp gaze to him. We don't have time to be smart. The longer he walks free, the more damage he does. Vance exhaled. I understand. But hiring someone. Hayes cut him off. Not just someone. She nodded toward the man sitting across from them in the car. He was built like a tank, his face covered in old scars. His knuckles were wrapped in tape, as if he had just come from a fight. His name was Vincent Rook, and he was the kind of man who didn't ask why. He just asked how much. Rook grinned, his deep voice smooth yet menacing. So, you want Carter gone? Hayes met his gaze, unflinching. I don't care how you do it. Just make sure it's permanent. Rook chuckled. That'll cost extra. Hayes smirked. Money isn't a problem. Rook leaned back, cracking his knuckles. Then consider it done. Vance shifted in his seat. This is risky, Linda. Hayes gave him a cold smile. Not if there's no one left to tell the story. Jamal didn't go home that night. Instead, he drove to a small, rundown bar on the edge of the city. A place where people went to disappear. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and bad decisions. Jamal ignored the stares as he walked to the back booth. Sitting there, sipping a glass of whiskey, was the one man he knew could help him. DeAndre Dre Cole, former street hustler turned private investigator. Dre smirked as Jamal slid into the seat across from him. Damn, Carter. You look rough, he teased. Jamal ignored him. I need a favor. Dre leaned back. This about Hayes? Jamal nodded. Dre whistled. Man, you really pissed that woman off. She's trying to kill me, Jamal said bluntly. Dre's smirk faded. That's serious, huh? Jamal nodded. I need to know who she's working with. Who's backing her? Who's doing her dirty work? Dre took a slow sip of his drink, considering. You know, most people, when they get death threats, they run. Jamal's eyes darkened. I don't run. Dre grinned. That's why I like you. He reached into his pocket and slid a folded piece of paper across the table. Jamal opened it. A name was scribbled in black ink. Vincent Rook. Jamal frowned. Who the hell is this? Dre's smirk disappeared. That's the guy they just hired to take you out. Jamal's stomach tightened. Dre leaned forward. Rook isn't some street thug, man. He's a ghost. Ex-military. Mercenary. This dude doesn't miss. Jamal clenched his jaw. So, Dre said, finishing his drink. What's your plan? Jamal exhaled slowly. Find him before he finds me. 2 nights later, Jamal was standing on a rooftop, overlooking the dimly lit parking lot below. He had been tracking Rook's movements for the past 24 hours. Thanks to Dre, he knew where Rook operated, an abandoned warehouse near the docks. Jamal adjusted the grip on his gun. He didn't like killing, but if it came down to him or Rook, it wasn't going to be him. The warehouse doors creaked open. Jamal tensed. Then he saw him. Vincent Rook stepped outside, lighting a cigarette, his broad shoulders barely shifting under his black leather jacket. Jamal took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was it. But before he could make a move, something cold pressed against the back of his head. A gun. Jamal froze. A voice whispered in his ear. Nice try, detective. Then, crack. A gunshot rang through the air. Jamal spun around, just in time to see the man behind him collapse to the ground. A bullet lodged in his skull. Jamal's heart pounded. Then, from the shadows, Dre stepped forward, lowering his smoking gun. Damn, Carter, Dre said, shaking his head. You gotta stop getting yourself killed. Jamal exhaled, his pulse still racing. You followed me. Dre smirked. Good thing I did. Jamal turned back, toward the parking lot. But Rook was gone. Jamal cursed under his breath. Dre sighed. Guess that means we're still in trouble, huh? Jamal's jaw tightened. Yeah. He looked down at the dead man at his feet. They're done playing games. Dre nodded. Then it's time we stop playing too. Meanwhile, Vincent Rook was already on the move. He stepped into an alleyway, pulling out his phone. Hayes answered on the first ring. Well, she asked. Rook smirked. Your boy's good. Almost too good. Hayes' tone sharpened. I don't want excuses. Rook exhaled smoke. Relax, Judge. I'll get him. He glanced down at his wristwatch. By this time tomorrow, he said smoothly, Jamal Carter will be dead. And he hung up. Back at the precinct, Jamal sat at his desk, rubbing his temples. His phone buzzed. A message. He opened it. One photo. Of his apartment. With a red X over it. Jamal's blood ran cold. They knew where he lived. He slowly exhaled. This wasn't a fight anymore. This was survival. And if they wanted him dead, he was going to make them regret ever trying. Jamal Carter sat at his desk, staring at the photo on his phone. The image of his apartment, marked with a red X, was a chilling reminder that the danger had come far too close to home. His hand trembled for a moment, but he forced it to still. Fear would get him killed. He couldn't afford to show any signs of weakness. He had known this day might come. the day when the fight would be taken to his doorstep. But now that it was here, the reality of the situation hit harder than he expected. Whoever was pulling the strings had no intention of letting him walk away. The knock on his office door was sharp and quick, snapping him out of his thoughts. "Come in," he called, his voice steadier than he felt. Captain Morris stepped in, his expression grim. "We've got a problem." Jamal's gaze shifted to the man. "Don't tell me. They've already made their move." Morris nodded. "Internal Affairs is pushing hard for your suspension. They've got new evidence on you. Nothing solid, but enough to create doubt." Jamal clenched his fists. "It's a setup. You know it. I know it." Morris took a step forward, lowering his voice. "I do. But the press? They don't. The city's already losing faith. If we don't do something big, we're going to lose this fight. You're going to lose." Jamal didn't need to be told twice. He already knew the stakes. He wasn't just fighting for his badge anymore. He was fighting for his life. He stood up, his mind racing. "Then we go on the offensive. It's time to go after Hayes." Morris raised an eyebrow. "How?" "We don't have much time, Carter. The walls are closing in." Jamal's expression hardened. "I'm not just going to sit here and let her take me down." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I need to get to her. We find out who's behind all of this." Morris exhaled slowly. "And you're sure you can handle it?" Jamal's eyes narrowed. "I don't have a choice." In a quiet, dimly lit room, Judge Hayes was sitting at her desk, flipping through legal papers. She had managed to shake off the immediate fallout from her corruption scandal, but she knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The door to her office opened without warning. She didn't look up. "What is it now?" Vincent Rook stepped inside, his face unreadable. "We need to talk." Hayes glanced up, her eyebrow twitching. "What's going on, Rook? I thought Carter was as good as dead." Rook's face darkened. "It's not that simple. Carter's tougher than we thought. He's playing the game, and now, he's looking for answers. He's close, Hayes. Too close for comfort." She clenched her jaw. "Then do whatever it takes to stop him." Rook smirked, the edge of his smile more dangerous than anything. "It's already in motion, but you're going to have to be patient. Carter's getting smart. If we rush this, we risk making mistakes." Hayes slammed her fist on the table. "We don't have time for patience. If he figures out who we're connected to," her voice trailed off, her fear evident for the first time. Rook met her gaze. "We'll finish him before he gets the chance to." Hayes took a deep breath, trying to regain control. "Good. Make sure it's done. I'm not losing to a detective." Rook nodded, his face cold. "You won't." Back at the precinct, Jamal was deep in thought. His plan was risky, but it was the only option he had left. He needed to go after Hayes directly, get close to her, learn everything. It was time to play her game. He walked over to his desk and grabbed his coat. Morris raised an eyebrow. "Where are you going?" Jamal paused, then turned back to his captain. "I need to get some answers." "Carter, you don't have time for a solo mission," Morris warned. "You're being watched. Everyone's got their eyes on you. If you slip up, they'll have enough to suspend you for good." Jamal shook his head. "Then I'll make sure I don't slip up." He headed for the door, and Morris didn't stop him. He knew there was no turning back for Jamal now. He was already in too deep. Jamal spent the next few hours tracking down every lead, every clue that could possibly link Hayes to her mysterious benefactors. He pulled strings with contacts who owed him favors, piecing together her moves over the past few months. Finally, a name surfaced, a name that made his stomach turn. Jonathan Welsley. He was a well-known political figure with deep pockets, a reputation for shady business dealings, and connections that spanned the city's highest levels. Jamal's pulse quickened. If Hayes was involved with Welsley, this wasn't just a corruption case anymore. It was a full-blown conspiracy. That night, Jamal stood outside a nondescript building on the edge of town, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew this was dangerous, too dangerous, but he had no choice. Welsley's connection to Hayes was the key, and Jamal needed to get to the bottom of it. He stepped into the building, his hand tight around his gun, his mind sharp. The building was empty, and the air felt thick with secrecy. A door at the far end of the hall opened, and a man stepped into view. Jonathan Welsley. Jamal's instincts kicked in. He pulled his gun and pointed it at Welsley's chest. "I need answers." Welsley's face remained calm. "Carter, I see you've made a lot of bad decisions lately." Jamal's finger tightened on the trigger. "Don't test me." Welsley raised his hand slowly. "I'm not here to fight, detective. But you need to understand, You've walked into something much bigger than you realize. This is not just about Hayes. Jamal's breath caught in his throat. Then what is it about? Welsley's smirk deepened. It's about power. And you, my friend, have just become part of the game. Before Jamal could react, two figures emerged from the shadows, both armed. Put the gun down, detective, one of them growled. Jamal's heart pounded as the realization hit him. This wasn't just a setup. This was a trap. And now he was trapped. Jamal's mind raced as the two armed figures stepped closer, their weapons trained directly on him. His hand still gripped his gun, but he knew it wouldn't do any good. He was outnumbered. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. Panic would only make things worse. The man, Jonathan Welsley, was still standing with his hands raised, a slight smirk playing on his lips. His calmness only made Jamal more uneasy. This was no ordinary criminal mastermind. Welsley had resources. He had connections. And now, Jamal was standing in the middle of whatever web he had spun. "You don't want to do this," Jamal said, his voice steady despite the situation. "This isn't going to end well for you." Welsley's smirk widened. "Oh, detective, I think you've got it all wrong." He motioned to the men surrounding him. "I'm not here to end things. I'm here to ensure they end the way I want them to." One of the armed men stepped forward. "Drop the weapon, Carter. You're out of your league." Jamal hesitated. He could fight back, sure. He could go down swinging. But he had a better chance of surviving if he could outsmart these men. "Fine," Jamal said, his voice cold. He slowly lowered his gun, letting it fall to the floor. "What now?" Welsley nodded in approval. "Good. Now we can talk." Jamal stayed silent, his mind working overtime. He had to find a way out of this. Welsley looked at one of his men, who stepped forward and grabbed Jamal by the arm, pulling him toward a set of double doors. "Come with us," the man said gruffly. Jamal didn't resist. His best chance right now was to stay alive and gather more information. The door creaked open, revealing a spacious, dimly lit room. There were monitors and surveillance equipment everywhere. A few people sat at desks, typing away, eyes focused on screens. "This is where the magic happens," Welsley said, gesturing around the room. "This is where the real power is. You were always just a pawn in a much larger game, detective." Jamal's stomach churned. He had always suspected there was something bigger going on, but now, hearing Welsley say it out loud, it made everything feel so real. "You're in deeper than you realize," Welsley continued, his voice soft. "And the people you've been trying to protect? They're all part of the game too. The mayor, the chief of police, the ones who pretend to fight for justice. None of them are clean, Carter." Jamal's jaw tightened. "And Hayes? What's her role in all this?" Welsley chuckled darkly. "Hayes is just a tool, a means to an end. She was always in it for the power, the prestige. But I pull the strings. I'm the one who decided it was time to get rid of you." Jamal's mind raced. This was the mastermind behind the whole operation. Welsley wasn't just pulling strings in the shadows. He was the puppet master, manipulating everyone around him. "Why me?" Jamal asked, keeping his voice steady. "Why go after a cop?" Welsley leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the moment. "Because, detective, you were the one thing standing in the way. You wanted to expose Hayes, and you were getting too close. You made this personal." Jamal kept his gaze steady, refusing to let Welsley see the fear or doubt that was creeping into his mind. "And now what? You think this is over? That you've won?" Welsley smiled, but it wasn't a smile of victory. It was one of cold calculation. "Oh, Carter, it's far from over. This is just the beginning." The man who had been holding Jamal stepped forward again, grabbing him roughly by the arm. "Take him to the back room," Welsley ordered. Jamal's heart raced as the man shoved him toward a small, isolated room at the far end of the building. The walls were bare, save for a small table in the center. One of the men shoved Jamal into the chair, his hands still cuffed behind his back. "You'll learn soon enough," Welsley's voice echoed from the other room. "You have no idea who you're really up against." Jamal clenched his jaw. He had to keep his cool. He had to find a way to turn this around. As the door closed behind him, Jamal was left alone in the small, dimly lit room. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. His mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. How could he escape? How could he get out of here and stop Welsley's operation? And then, just as he thought he couldn't take it anymore, he heard a soft click from the corner of the room. A small device appeared from the shadows, a figure emerging from behind a shelf. It was Dre. "You thought I'd leave you hanging, huh?" Dre's grin was as sly as ever. You're a real pain in the ass to track down, Carter. But you're welcome. Jamal couldn't help but laugh, relief flooding his chest. You just saved my life, Dre. Dre winked. I know. Let's get you out of here. It didn't take long for Jamal and Dre to make their way out of the building. With Dre's help, they'd taken down a few of Welsley's men on their way through the hallways. But Jamal's mind was focused on one thing, the final confrontation. He couldn't leave things as they were. He needed to confront Welsley, in this once and for all. As they reached the main entrance, Dre stopped him. Carter, you can't take down Welsley alone. You need backup. The whole system's against you. Jamal paused, looking at Dre, then at the door that led to freedom. He could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. The walls were closing in, and Welsley wasn't going to stop. I'm not backing down, Jamal said, his voice firm. Not now, not ever. With one final glance at Dre, Jamal turned toward the exit. He had a target now. He had a mission, and Welsley's reign of power was about to come crashing down. Back in the heart of the city, Welsley sat in his office, watching a live feed of the building's security cameras. A calm smile spread across his face as he saw Jamal leave the building. He's a fighter, Welsley muttered to himself. But all fighters have their limits. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. He's out. Find him. And finish it. As he hung up, a cold laugh escaped his lips. This game isn't over, detective. But Jamal wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Jamal stepped out of the building, breathing in the cool night air. His heart was still racing, but a sense of clarity had washed over him. Dre had gotten him out of the building, but now the real fight was just beginning. As Jamal moved quickly, staying low, he knew he couldn't trust anyone. His best chance now was to go after Welsley directly, using the information he had gathered. He had seen the way things were connected, how deep the corruption ran, and he couldn't let it go. But as he walked toward his car, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his stomach twisting as he saw the text message. We know where you are. Don't think you're getting away this time. The threat was clear. Jamal clenched his jaw. He couldn't stay here. Not for long. He needed to keep moving, to stay one step ahead of Welsley's men. They wouldn't stop until he was dead. He glanced around, scanning the dark streets for any signs of movement. He could feel their eyes on him. He was being watched. And then, just as he was about to get into his car, a voice came from behind him. Looking for something, detective? Jamal spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't heard anyone approach. Standing there, in the shadows, was Vincent Rook, the mercenary, the one who had been after him since he set foot in Welsley's operation. Jamal's hand instinctively moved toward his gun, but Rook raised a hand. Easy there. I'm not here to fight. At least, not yet. Jamal narrowed his eyes. What do you want? Rook smirked, his face cold. I want to make a deal. You're outmatched, Carter. You can't keep running forever. And you know that. Jamal didn't lower his weapon. I'm not interested in deals. Rook laughed, low and menacing. You should be. Welsley is too powerful for you to take down alone. He's got connections everywhere. You really think you can just walk into his world and pull the rug out from under him? Jamal stared him down. You think I'm scared of him? Rook's smirk widened. You should be. You've already made a lot of enemies, detective. You're not getting out of this one without a price. Jamal gritted his teeth. I'll pay whatever it takes to stop him. Rook raised an eyebrow. I know you're desperate. But the thing is, you don't have to do it alone. I'm offering you a chance to stop him before it's too late. All I ask in return is that you trust me. Jamal's instincts screamed at him to walk away, but he was running out of options. His options were limited, and right now, Rook might be the only person who could help him. I'm listening, Jamal said, his voice steady. Rook stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Jamal's. Welsley has a secret. A huge secret. Something that could destroy him and everything he's built. But you'll need my help to find it. Jamal clenched his fists. What's the catch? The catch is that Welsley knows you're coming for him. He's already planning his next move. If you want to take him down, you need to act fast. And I'm your only way in. Jamal was silent for a long moment, his mind working through the options. He didn't trust Rook. He didn't trust anyone right now. But his gut told him this was a chance he couldn't pass up. All right, Jamal finally said. I'll work with you. But this better not be a trick, Rook. If you betray me, I'll make sure you regret it. Rook's smile was sharp, but there was something in his eyes that seemed genuine. You have my word, detective. Welsley won't see it coming. The next day, Jamal and Rook met at a secure location, an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It was a neutral ground, the perfect place for secret meetings. As Jamal walked in, Rook was already there, leaning against a stack of crates. He had a laptop open in front of him, his fingers flying over the keys. "Sit down," Rook said without looking up. "I've got the intel you need." Jamal sat across from him, watching as Rook pulled up files on the screen. "These are Welsley's financials," Rook said. "Hidden accounts, shell companies, offshore holdings. He's been laundering money through a fake charity for years. But here's the thing. He's been getting help from someone inside the system." Jamal leaned forward. "Who?" Rook clicked on a file, revealing a list of names. "This man, Deputy Chief Ryan Harris. He's been helping Welsley cover his tracks. And not just that. He's been feeding information to Hayes, keeping her protected." Jamal's eyes widened. "Harris? I've worked with him before." Rook nodded. "Yeah, he's clean on the outside. But he's deep in Welsley's pocket. And he's the one calling the shots when it comes to keeping you out of the picture." Jamal felt a pit grow in his stomach. If Harris was involved, that meant the corruption was even deeper than he thought. "We need to move fast," Rook said. "If Harris is the key, then we need to expose him. Get him to flip. If we take him down, we take down the whole operation." Jamal thought for a moment. "And what happens to Welsley?" Rook's smile was cold. "Welsley will be next. But you'll have to make sure it's done clean. No messes. No loose ends." Jamal stood up. "Let's do this." The next few days were a blur of planning, digging, and gathering evidence. Rook and Jamal worked together in the shadows, keeping their movements low, making sure Welsley and Harris didn't catch on. Finally, the pieces fell into place. Jamal had what he needed. The evidence was airtight, and Welsley was exposed. But just as Jamal was about to make his move, a phone call shattered everything. It was from Captain Morris. "Carter, we have a situation. Harris is in the wind. He knows we're onto him, and he's gone underground. Welsley has him, and they're planning something big. I don't know how long we've got before they pull the trigger." Jamal's stomach sank. He knew what this meant. Harris had been their inside man all along. And now, with Welsley pulling the strings, the game had just gone from bad to worse. It was time for the final showdown. And this time, there would be no backing down. Jamal stood in the small, dimly lit room, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a vice. His phone buzzed again, but he didn't need to look at the screen to know it was Morris. The situation had gone from bad to worse, and now, everything depended on how well Jamal could play his final hand. "Carter, listen to me." Morris's voice crackled through the phone. "This isn't just a bust anymore. Welsley's preparing something big. They're moving Harris, and if you don't act fast, it's over. For all of us." Jamal's stomach tightened. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud hit like a punch to the gut. Welsley, the man he'd been chasing for months, was about to make his move. And Deputy Chief Harris? The man who had been in Welsley's pocket from the start? He was about to play his final card. "I know," Jamal said, his voice steady despite the growing pressure. "But I've got something on Harris. It's time to pull the trigger." "Are you sure?" "You know what this means," Morris warned. "If you go after Harris, it's not just Welsley anymore. It's the whole department. The DA. Everyone. I don't care anymore," Jamal muttered. "I'm not letting this go on any longer." He disconnected the call, his thoughts spinning like a whirlwind. He had the evidence now. Proof of Harris's betrayal, his connection to Welsley, and their illegal dealings. It was all locked away on a flash drive, ready to expose everything. But Jamal knew he couldn't just hand it over to internal affairs or the press. If he did, Welsley's men would be on him faster than he could blink. He had to take them down, not just expose them. He had to make sure they wouldn't hurt anyone else. His hands gripped the edges of the table as his mind raced. If he wanted to stop Harris and Welsley, he needed a plan. A big one. Hours later, Jamal was crouched in the shadows outside a high-rise building on the edge of the city. He knew Welsley's men were coming to meet here, the final location where everything would go down. Harris would be there too, protected by the men who had kept him hidden. It was now or never. "Rook," Jamal said, his voice low in the comms device in his ear. "I need you in position. If Harris tries to run, don't hesitate. Take him down." Rook's voice crackled in his ear. "I got it, Carter. You just make sure Welsley doesn't slip through your fingers." Jamal didn't answer. He didn't need to. He had one goal in mind. Get to Welsley and take him out, once and for all. He waited. His eyes scanned the entrance of the building. He was ready. He had to be. The soft hum of a car engine broke through the silence. Jamal stiffened. He recognized the vehicle, Welsley's black SUV. The time had come. As the SUV pulled into the building's garage, Jamal's heart rate quickened. He watched through his binoculars as two men got out of the vehicle, checking their surroundings before heading inside. But they weren't the only ones. He quickly pulled out his phone and sent a message to Morris. "It's happening. We're moving in. I'll handle Welsley. You keep Harris contained." The reply was almost immediate. "Be careful, Carter." Jamal smirked. He didn't have time for caution anymore. This wasn't about being careful. This was about making sure Welsley paid for everything he'd done. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and moved toward the building's side entrance. His steps were calculated, each movement precise as he slid into the shadows. There were cameras everywhere, but he'd disabled them on his way in. He couldn't afford to be seen. Not yet. Inside the building, Welsley's men were already assembling. Jamal could hear the low murmur of voices as he moved down the hallway toward the room where the meeting would take place. His hand hovered near his weapon, his mind sharp. This was it, the moment he'd been waiting for. He rounded the corner and spotted the door to the conference room. The meeting was happening inside. He could hear Welsley's voice, low and measured, as he spoke to someone inside. "We need to move quickly," Welsley said. "Harris is the key. Once we take care of Carter, everything falls into place." Jamal didn't hesitate. He pushed the door open just enough to get a glimpse inside. Welsley was standing at the head of the table, talking to Harris, who was seated across from him, still wearing his uniform. They didn't notice Jamal's presence, but what he saw made his blood run cold. Harris wasn't just sitting there as a passive player in the game. He was smiling, too. He was as much a part of this as Welsley. They had planned this all along, every move, every step of the game. Jamal's jaw clenched. There was no more room for mistakes. If he hesitated now, it would all fall apart. He pushed the door open fully and stepped into the room, his voice a low growl. "I wouldn't move if I were you." Everyone inside froze. Welsley's eyes widened in recognition. "Carter, I thought you'd be dead by now." "You should have finished the job," Jamal replied, his voice cold. "Because now, it's your turn." Before anyone could react, Jamal moved quickly, pulling out his gun and pointing it directly at Welsley. The room erupted in chaos as Harris reached for his own weapon. But Jamal was faster. He fired 2 quick shots, disabling Harris before he could draw the gun. Welsley's eyes darted around the room. "You think you've won?" he spat. "You're just a cop, Carter. You can't take me down. You're out of your depth." Jamal stepped forward, his voice steady. "I'm not here to win, Welsley. I'm here to make sure you never hurt anyone again." Welsley's face twisted into a mask of fury. "You think you have control of this? You're just a pawn in a much bigger game. Even if you kill me, you'll never get away. You're dead either way." Jamal didn't flinch. "You're not the one who decides that." He pulled out the flash drive, the one containing all the evidence on Welsley and Harris. He tossed it onto the table, just within Welsley's reach. "If you want to live, start talking," Jamal said. "Tell me everything you know about the people behind this operation. Tell me how deep it goes." Welsley laughed bitterly. "You think I'll just roll over? I've been untouchable my entire life. You can't make me talk. I'll take you down with me." Jamal stepped closer, keeping the gun trained on him. "You're not leaving this room alive, Welsley. But if you want to save yourself, you'll give me names." "Now," Welsley sneered. "You don't get it, Carter. No one's coming to save you." And just as he spoke, Jamal felt the floor shift beneath him. The faint sound of footsteps echoed through the halls. Backup was on the way, but the question now was, would Welsley make it to prison, or would he try to take everyone down with him? Jamal wasn't going to wait to find out. He had to act fast. Jamal stood in the center of the room, his gun steady, eyes locked on Welsley. The sound of footsteps outside the door echoed, growing louder with each passing second. His instincts screamed at him to move, to finish this. But he couldn't let Welsley get away. Not now. Not after everything. "You're running out of time," Jamal said, his voice low. "I suggest you start talking before I make you." Welsley's face twisted with contempt, his lips curling into a bitter smile. "You think you can stop this? You think you can win? You're playing a game you'll never understand, detective." Jamal's finger tightened on the trigger. "I understand enough. The only thing I don't understand is why you still think you have any control here." The door to the conference room suddenly slammed open, and Jamal's head snapped toward the sound. Two men in suits stepped into the room, their faces familiar. They were internal affairs agents, but Jamal knew instantly they were working for Welsley. His heart sank. This was the moment he had feared. They were too late to stop Harris, and now Welsley was about to play his last card. The first agent pulled a gun from his coat. His aim immediately focused on Jamal. "Put the gun down, Carter. This is over." Jamal's pulse quickened, but he kept his weapon trained on Welsley. He didn't know how long he had, but he wasn't going to give up without a fight. "Don't do it," Welsley sneered. "You think I'm going to let you walk away? These men work for me. You're done." "Not yet," Jamal said, his eyes still on Welsley. "I've got everything I need. All of it's on that drive." The agent in the doorway flinched, but didn't lower his gun. "You're going to regret this, Carter." Jamal's mind raced. He had to get out of here before Welsley and his people turned the tables. They had him cornered, but he still had one advantage. He knew the building. He had studied the layout. He knew where every exit was, and he wasn't about to be taken down in some conference room. Without warning, he lunged forward, knocking the first agent off balance. The gun went off, but the shot missed. Welsley shouted something, but Jamal didn't hear him. His focus was entirely on getting out. He sprinted toward the door, shoving it open, and bolted down the hallway, the sound of footsteps behind him growing louder. He had seconds. He needed to get to the stairwell and make his way to the back exit. His heart pounded in his chest, and adrenaline surged through him. Welsley's men were close now. Jamal could hear them getting nearer with every step. But he was faster, his years of training kicking in. He reached the stairwell and flew up the steps, hoping to lose them in the maze of hallways and emergency exits. But just as he reached the next floor, he heard something that made his blood run cold, the sound of a helicopter. It was faint at first, but growing louder by the second. Welsley had planned for this. He wasn't going to let Jamal escape. Jamal's hand tightened around the railing. He couldn't waste any more time. He reached the roof and burst through the exit door, only to be met by the glaring lights of a helicopter hovering above. The shadows of more men in black suits and tactical gear appeared on the rooftop. "No one escapes," a voice shouted from above. Jamal's mind was racing. He had been outsmarted, cornered. His options were running out. He couldn't outrun a helicopter, and with the agents on the ground, he was trapped. But he wasn't done yet. He turned quickly, scanning the roof. There was one way out, an old service elevator that led to the maintenance area. He made a split-second decision, running toward it, using every ounce of energy he had left. As he reached the elevator shaft, he saw them. Welsley's men were already closing in. His fingers flew over the buttons, but the elevator doors refused to open. He was out of time. He had to move. Without thinking, Jamal jumped, grabbing onto the edge of the elevator shaft, hoisting himself up and into the maintenance tunnel above. He heard the shots ringing out below him, but none of them hit. He pulled himself into the shaft and crawled through the narrow space, using the shadows to stay hidden. He knew that every second counted. Welsley's men, meanwhile, were scrambling on the rooftop, searching for Jamal. The helicopter was still circling overhead, its searchlight cutting through the dark, but it was clear they had lost him. For now. Inside the building, Welsley paced back and forth in his office, fuming. How did he escape? He roared, his face contorted in fury. Find him. The men who had been tracking Jamal reported that he had disappeared into the maintenance tunnels. Welsley slammed his fist on the desk. He's not getting away this time. We'll find him. No one crosses me and lives. His voice was full of venom, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. Jamal had escaped once again. Welsley didn't know it, but Jamal had already won. The pieces were in place, and the truth would soon come to light. Jamal was alive, and he was going to expose everything. Hours later, Jamal emerged from the tunnels, battered and exhausted, but still alive. He made his way through the back streets, avoiding the main roads where Welsley's men were likely hunting for him. His phone buzzed again. It was Morris. "Carter? You there? We've got a problem." Morris sounded more urgent than ever. "They're mobilizing everything. We need to move fast. The DA's office is about to get involved, and I think they might be cleaning up their mess before we can take Welsley down. Where are you?" Jamal looked around at the dark alley he was standing in. He had no time to waste. It was now or never. "I've got something better than evidence, Captain," Jamal said, his voice low and steady. "I've got Welsley on the ropes. I know who he's working with. I know what he's hiding, and I'm not letting him get away. I'll be there soon. You're going to want to see this. And with that, Jamal began the final steps of his journey. The pieces were in place. The trap had been set. Now, all he had to do was make sure that Welsley and his entire criminal empire crumbled to the ground. It was time for the world to know the truth. Jamal Carter didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. The weight of everything, the evidence he'd gathered, the people he had put in harm's way, the lives he was about to change forever, weighed heavy on his mind. But he knew one thing for sure. This was his last shot. He wasn't going to walk away. Not when it was so close. Not when everything was finally within reach. He walked into the precinct just before dawn, his steps deliberate, but his mind calm. He had done the impossible. He had survived. And now, he was about to end it. The moment he stepped into Captain Morris's office, Morris stood up, his eyes filled with both relief and concern. You made it back, I thought. He stopped when he saw the determined look on Jamal's face. Jamal placed a thick file on the desk, the same flash drive that had been his lifeline throughout this whole ordeal. It's over, Captain. Welsley's gone down. For good. Morris's brows furrowed. You're sure? I mean, this is bigger than any case we've ever seen. If we're wrong. We're not, Jamal said, his voice unwavering. I've got everything. Harris, Welsley, the entire operation. They were all in on it. He paused. It's all on this flash drive. Morris took the drive and plugged it into his computer, his fingers hovering over the keyboard as the documents appeared on screen. His face paled as he scrolled through the files, his eyes widening with disbelief. Dear God, he muttered. I knew it was bad, but I had no idea it was this bad. Jamal nodded grimly. I've been on the inside, Captain. I saw how deep this went. And now, we bring it all to light. He exhaled, letting the tension finally leave his body. The DA's office will be in touch. They've already been tracking Welsley's money, and this is the final piece. All we have to do now is hand it over, and it's over. Morris let out a breath, rubbing his face. You sure you're ready for this? There's no going back. This'll shake the city to its core. A lot of people are going to lose everything, starting with Harris. I'm ready, Jamal said, his voice firm. This is what we signed up for. This is why I'm a cop. To bring down the ones who think they're untouchable. Morris stood up and placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder. You've done it, Carter. But let me tell you, we did it. Together. Jamal gave a small, grim smile. We still have a lot of work to do. But I'll take the credit for now. The next few days were a whirlwind. Jamal watched as the pieces began to fall. Welsley was arrested. Harris was taken into custody. And the corruption that had infected the police department, the city's government, and even the judiciary was exposed for all to see. As the investigation unfolded, Jamal became a hero in the eyes of some, and a target for others. There were whispers in the halls of the precinct, whispers of admiration and fear. He had been the one who brought down one of the most dangerous men in the city, but that made him a symbol. And symbols were dangerous. Welsley's empire crumbled faster than anyone could have imagined. His ties to politicians, corporate heads, and law enforcement were uncovered. The scale of his operation shocked everyone, and Jamal's name became synonymous with justice in the city. But Jamal didn't let it go to his head. He didn't need the fame. What mattered was that he had done what he set out to do. He had exposed the truth. He had fought for what was right, and he had won. Months passed, and life began to return to a semblance of normalcy. Jamal was no longer the cop on the edge, the man who was always one step away from losing everything. He had brought down the corrupt. He had survived, but there were scars. The truth always left marks. The people who had been his friends, his allies, now treated him with a different kind of respect. Some of them saw him as a cautionary tale. Others were grateful, but all of them knew Jamal Carter had changed. He stood in front of the mirror in his apartment, his reflection staring back at him. He was older, wiser, and a little more worn, but the fire was still there. The fight was still in him. His phone rang, snapping him from his thoughts. It was Captain Morris. Carter, Morris said with a smile in his voice. You know the DA wants to throw you a big ceremony, right? Jamal smirked, shaking his head. I'm not in this for a ceremony, Captain. I know, Morris said, but they want to honor you. They said it was your work that made everything possible. They said you saved the city. Jamal paused, thinking for a moment. I didn't save the city, Captain. The city saved itself. It just needed someone to light the fire. You lit it all right, Morris laughed. Well, you let me know if you change your mind about the ceremony. But if you're not going, I think it's safe to say that we've officially closed this case. Jamal looked out the window, his thoughts still swirling. I've got some more work to do, he said quietly. There's always more to do. And with that, Jamal Carter hung up the phone. He wasn't done yet. The city might have been safer for now, but there were always more battles to fight. And for Jamal, the fight wasn't over. Not while there were still people who needed justice. And he was always going to be there, ready to bring it, no matter what it cost. And that was how Jamal Carter, the cop who brought down an empire, became a living symbol of hope. The city would never forget what he had done, and neither would he. He had won the war, but the fight for justice would always continue.